Okay, happy Sunday everybody. Welcome to China Update. Today's episode is a little bit different to what we normally do. For those of you who are only interested in the news updates of China Update, feel free to skip this video. You will not be missing anything, and when we continue with regular episodes from tomorrow, you would not have missed any critical information. So if you're only interested in the news updates, feel free to exit this video now. But for everyone else who might be interested in, this will be Sunday Book Club, when we will look maybe once a month or once every 4 or 5 weeks at a new book about China, or maybe an old existing book about China, where we explore some of the ideas of the author and maybe give you guys an introduction to what could end up being a good read. So this is a bit more casual. We're just going to go through interesting books by interesting authors. I don't necessarily agree with the opinions of the author. It's merely to look at different perspectives every once in a while and allow a thinker or an author to unpack their ideas rather than just using shorter quotes, which is necessitated when we do the shorter news analysis clips that we normally do. So I hope you enjoy this new series. Like I said, it should be about once a month, maybe once every 5 or 6 weeks. Let me know in the comments what you think. I would also take book recommendations if you have any. I have a few that I do want to cover, but for today's Sunday Book Club, China Update Book Club, the book that I wanted to discuss is the new book from Susan Shirk called Overreach. This is a book that I've been looking forward to reading for some time. I'm about halfway through it. I only started it a couple of days ago. It's very good. Susan Shirk, she had a book that she previously wrote called Fragile Superpower, which though is quite old now, is still an excellent book, I think, if we want to think about how China operates as a political and economic actor. Susan Shirk is director of the 21st Century China Center and research professor at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. She first started visiting China as early as the 1970s, and she was former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the East Asia and Pacific Bureau during the Bill Clinton administration. Now, I think we should jump in the book. We should note at the beginning that I do not have any affiliation with this author, nor am I receiving any commission or any money for advertising the book. It's an interesting book. She's a good scholar, she's a good writer, and I think that her view is fairly representative of elite, what you would say the academic or the foreign policy elite perspective in Washington. So it's certainly worth reading to get that perspective. So without any further ado, let's jump into Overreach by Susan Shirk. The mobilization against China extends well beyond the Trump administration. A bipartisan American consensus has formed around the idea that China is an adversary determined to supplant United States leadership and harm democracies. President Biden is reinforcing this consensus by declaring that she firmly believes that within a decade or so, China is going to own America because autocracies can make their own quick decisions. Biden has been framing much of his domestic as well as his foreign policy agenda as a battle between democracies and autocracies. In Congress, practically the only thing Democrats and Republicans can agree on is legislation to condemn China's actions and restrict its access to American technology. Democratic Senator Mark Warner and Republican Senator Marco Rubio, ideological antagonists, teamed up to convene sessions for counter-espionage briefing teams from the FBI and other intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Their purpose being to warn universities, businesses, and state and local governments about the Chinese spies and agents operating in their midst. The American government argues that China's rapid advances in such emerging dual-use technologies as artificial intelligence, digital communications, robotics, quantum computing, and biotechnology pose a grave threat to American national security. In the past, whenever the Pentagon and other security agencies sought to limit technology transfer to China, business groups lobbied for unrestricted commerce, and the White House struck a happy medium. Today, the business community is no longer standing up for engagement with China. Companies are fed up with Chinese regulatory shakedowns and pressures to transfer technology as the price of gaining access to China's huge market. This bargain has become less and less appealing, as China's leaders have been open about their game plan to build up their own national champions to replace foreign firms. It is the rare American business executive who dares to speak out about any unfair treatment for fear of retaliation. Most of them, however, are ready to go along with a tougher US government approach. Without corporate support to provide the ballast, the security and defense agency's perspective dominates America's response. Until recently, the American public was more sanguine than the politicians about our relations with a rising China. Year after year, public opinion polls showed that roughly half of all Americans had a favorable attitude towards China and saw China as equally a rival and a partner. Pew surveys showed that American views on China turned somewhat more negative after 2013, but improved again in 2017 and 2018. But in 2019, all the major opinion surveys showed a sharp increase in negative views. By 2020, according to Pew, 2/3 of Americans were unfavorable to China, a historic high and a big increase from 2 years before, 47% in 2018. As of 2022, 82% of Americans are unfavorable towards China. The coronavirus pandemic that originated in Wuhan and spread internationally during an information cover-up by Chinese government officials further damaged the country's image in the eyes of Americans. The gap between public and elite opinion is therefore closing. Both are turning more hostile towards China. Americans' perspective may be colored by worries about a loss of dominance, but other countries are also growing more suspicious of China, suggesting that its own actions are the source of the problem. A broad international backlash is snowballing. Many European Union countries are increasing scrutiny of Chinese investments to restrict access to European technology. They also are banning Huawei 5G networks, mainly because they don't trust the Chinese government not to interfere. European public opinion is becoming more unfavorable towards China, with countries in Western and Northern Europe, such as Sweden, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, being the most critical, their positive views declining after 2018. European attitudes towards China are now hardening even more because of China's failure to distance itself from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Europeans are particularly critical of China's human rights violations. In an unprecedented move, the European Union joined Canada and the United States in March 2021 to impose sanctions on 4 Chinese officials and 1 organization responsible for abuses against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, their placement in what are being called re-education camps. After Beijing imposed retaliatory sanctions that extended to European think tanks and scholars, the European Parliament killed the comprehensive trade and investment agreement that it had recently concluded with China. Even in developing countries where China has made large loans to fund the building of dams, ports, railways, and other infrastructure projects, many of them part of Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative, politicians and citizens are debating whether the benefits of these projects outweigh the risks of dependency on China. Public opinion in Africa, where China has concentrated its investments, is the most positive in the world, though there has been a moderate decline in some countries. In Latin America, sizable minorities in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina have unfavorable views of China. In every country that holds elections, ties with China have become politically controversial. Challengers go against incumbents for cozying up to China. China's Asian neighbors have experienced the sharpest decline in friendly feelings towards it, expressing their greatest worries about military aggression from China. Pew found that opinion in the Asian countries have fallen to historic lows. In South Korea, positive views fell 42% in 2022 compared with 2015. A survey of Southeast Asian elites found that they considered China the least trustworthy country in the region when compared to Japan, the European Union, the United States, and India. The percentage of elite respondents having little or no confidence in China to do the right thing when it comes to contributing to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance rose from 51.5% in 2019 to 63% in 2021. Elite distrust is particularly and understandably high among countries with sovereignty disputes with China, 82.1% in the Philippines and 75.4% in Vietnam. As an analyst looking at Pew results put it, almost half of all surveyed elites view China as a revisionist power with an intent to turn Southeast Asia into its sphere of influence. Australians' views have also turned much colder, When asked by the Lowy Institute whether China could be trusted to act responsibly in the world, only 23% of Australians polled in 2020 said it could, less than half of the 52% who said it could in 2018. 81% of Australians now see China negatively. Hey guys, if you enjoy China Update and you like what I'm trying to do here with the channel and you would like to help me keep it sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is one of the best ways you can help me continue making these videos for you guys every day. If you like this episode in particular, don't forget to hit the like button, that's also a big help. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. The growing global perception is that friendship with China is no longer unconditional. Beijing rewards countries that endorse its stance on sensitive domestic issues such as Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong by providing them with access to its huge market and generous investments, and it punishes countries who don't by withholding its economic favors. Malaysia's Prime Minister explained in an interview in 2019 why Beijing was able to persuade 37 countries, half of them Muslim, including his own, to defend China's camps in Xinjiang at the United Nations. "You don't just try to do something which would fail anyway," he put it, "so it is better to find some other less violent ways not to antagonize China too much, because China is beneficial for us." Some domestic international relations experts acknowledge that China lacks genuine friends or allies even among its neighbors, and that despite its being the most important economic partner of every Asian country, these countries increasingly fear China. Much as American politicians and officials in the past have periodically recriminated one another for mishandling relations with China, Chinese policy elites are asking themselves, how did China lose the West? And casting about for whom to blame. Privately, many Chinese experts blame Xi Jinping for provoking the animosity towards China. Obviously, they don't do it to the degree that foreign critics do, some of whom vilify Xi as an evil dictator bent on destroying universal values and global order. Nevertheless, President Trump had fans in China who welcomed his pressure as a check on Xi's imprudent policies. The CCP, however, has a simple explanation for why the West has turned against China. It's the inevitable outcome of the shifting balance of power, they argue, and was bound to occur as soon as the power gap between China and the US narrowed. Some claim that America was always going to turn against a country once it reached 60% of US GDP, as the Soviet Union did during the Cold War and Japan did in the 1980s. Now it's China's turn. As China's economic, technological, and military power grows, America protects its superpower status by going all out to impede it. This mechanistic view resembles the ideas of realist international relations scholars who argue that the rise and fall of nations always causes the reigning power to exaggerate the threat, a misperception that can lead to war between it and the rising power. This pattern has been called the Thucydides trap, named for the Greek historian who chronicled Sparta's overreaction to Athens' rise, which led to the Peloponnesian War. For decades, Chinese leaders have recognized the risk that other countries will view their country as a threat just because of its rapid rise. In a 2015 speech in Seattle, Xi Jinping argued that there was no such thing as the so-called Thucydides trap in the world. But he went on to say that, should major countries time and again make the mistakes of strategic miscalculation, they might create such traps for themselves. According to China's official media, the escalating tensions between the two countries are entirely due to America's containment policy, which is itself a strategic miscalculation. Official commentaries in People's Daily, the most authoritative source for government policy, refute erroneous views and pessimistic arguments being circulated that say that China provoked the United States by taking high-profile postures. No matter what China does, China's development endangers American primacy and leads America to re-emphasize its policy of containment, the newspaper asserts. The trade war has become a way to mobilize society for containment of China, explains the influential Chinese nationalist tabloid Global Times. Some commentators in other countries share the Chinese view that the American backlash is an inside-the-beltway phenomenon caused by Americans' anxieties about their decline and completely unrelated to any actions on China's part. But ignoring the role of China's own behavior, makes the explanation of US-China enmity incomplete. I would argue that China's leaders have brought the backlash on themselves, and they have done it, as this book will show, by overreaching. Overreach means to defeat oneself by seeking to do or gain too much, or, according to another definition, going to excess in a way that is costly to oneself. After decades of restraint, the Chinese government started confronting other countries and tightening controls over domestic social and economic life. Then the policy choices of China's leadership boomeranged, provoking a defensive counter-reaction from other countries by harming and alarming them. Since taking power in 2012, she has centralized power by creating an ambiguous, integrated program that combines much of what each bureaucratic interest group wants and also plays well into the nationalist public, building on the fables about domestic and foreign threats that the interest groups spun during the Hu era. Xi's one-man rule is taking China even further in the direction of overreach. He believes his own myths. No one dares question him or give him bad news. Other politicians, officials, mass media editors, and corporate executives bandwagon behind Xi's line, competing with one another to gain his favor and protect themselves from his wrath. When they carry out his policies, they overcomply, going to extremes to stand out as the most loyal. The result is foreign and domestic policy hubris.